Summer of 1944, an airbase in the heart of Texas. Heat shimmered over the concrete runways, and the buzzing of cicadas mixed with the metallic clatter of wrenches striking aluminum frames. For the newly arrived Luftwaffe aces, captured only weeks earlier and now brought here as prestige prisoners, the scene was almost incomprehensible. Before them, lined up under hangars that looked like oversized railway sheds, stood not just fighters ready for flight, but machines fitted with enormous silver belly tanks stretching under the wings like strange organs. To the American technicians tightening bolts with methodical gestures, the detail seemed ordinary. To the German officers, it was a living paradox. Everything they had been taught, every lesson from the front, told them such extra weight should cripple maneuverability, wear out engines, turn the aircraft into easy prey. And yet here they were, entire rows of P-51 Mustangs and Thunderbolts equipped with additional fuel reservoirs, ready to span oceans. The smell was of high-octane gasoline, sharp, sweet, clinging to the air like an aggressive perfume. The prisoners wrinkled their noses, not only at the odor but at what it implied: liquid abundance, fuel in quantities the Reich could no longer even dream of. One of them, still in a faded blue uniform, watched silently as American soldiers secured bolts with rehearsed speed. In the background, the deep voice of a sergeant echoed like a metronome, calling out clipped orders lost in the back and forth of trucks unloading metal drums. Each drum, stamped with black codes, seemed an insult. Barrel after barrel, poured freely into supplementary tanks. In Germany, every drop was already measured like liquid gold. One detail drew more attention than any speech. At the corner of the hangar, resting on a workbench, lay one of those empty aluminum tanks. An American mechanic ran his hand across its smooth, almost polished surface, then tapped it with his knuckles. A hollow, clear sound rang out like a bell. The echo spread through the hangar, and the Germans exchanged quick glances. Propaganda had told them, and they had told themselves, that the enemy faced the same limits they did: short range, limited missions, reliance on vulnerable forward bases. That shining object, so simple and yet so alien, overturned the entire premise. The contrast was brutal. They had come from a Europe plunged into nightly blackouts, whole cities hidden under curtains of fear. Here in Texas, the hangars stood bright in the afternoon sun. Fans roared as they pushed cool air, and men worked without hurry, as if time itself were on their side. Outside, transport trucks stood parked, loaded with interchangeable parts, crates of ammunition, rolled-up maps. A world where logistics were not a desperate worry, but a fluent mechanism. One of the younger prisoners, who days earlier had laughed at the idea of bombers crossing continents escorted by fighters, let slip a barely audible murmur. His companions didn't scold him. Laughter, once a shield against anxiety, now stuck in their throats. There was no denying what they saw. Something that should not work, something doctrine said was impossible, stood before them, multiplied by dozens, ready to fly. As they walked back under the guards' watchful eyes, the image of those silver tanks clung to their vision: the metallic sound, the glare under the Texan sun, the sweet sting of fresh fuel, all combined into a picture that no longer fit their certainties. It felt as though they had caught a glimpse of some larger, invisible machinery, one whose reach they could not yet measure. And in that uncomfortable silence, each of them, in his own way, began to understand that the war they knew was changing. The explanation of how those wings could now carry fighters all the way to Berlin had not yet been spoken, but there was no laughter left. The hollow ring of that aluminum tank echoed instead, like a warning soon to be filled with distance and fire. The silver tanks were not dead weight, nor last-minute improvisations. They were parts designed to lock into place within seconds under the wings, feeding the engines with a steady flow of fuel. A rubber hose, strapped with metal clamps, ran to the fuselage and blended seamlessly into the system as if it had always been part of the aircraft. When the tank emptied, a lever released the latch, and the pilot simply let it fall into the sea or over empty fields. The fighter, lighter now, regained its agility as if it had never carried the load. Inside the Texan hangar, the demonstration was almost theatrical. A mechanic turned a valve, and the sound of liquid coursing through pipes echoed within the frame. The strong smell of gasoline spread through the hot air, while the Germans, arms crossed, tried to make sense of what they saw. There were no clumsy welds, no tangled cables. Every piece looked purpose-built, interchangeable, ready to be swapped. One American soldier, his shirt stained with grease, removed an empty tank and replaced it with a full one in less than 2 minutes. his hands moving with the ease of repetition. The contrast was immediate. While the Luftwaffe's fighters depended on hidden forward bases, increasingly exposed, here autonomy came from a portable accessory, multiplied at will, almost casual. The Germans knew the burden of improvisation, drums buried in clearings, fuel trucks moving only at night to avoid attack. Here supply looked like an invisible line stretched across oceans, carried by tankers and endless rails. The roar of test engines confirmed it. The machine didn't just work, it thundered with vigor. The prisoners followed with their eyes, some frowning, others turning away as if the sight itself pained them. One stared at the Mustang's panel as the engine fired. The fuel gauge climbed steadily, and the Merlin's growl held firm. No sputters, no strain, no excess vibration, no sign of burden. The aircraft bore the extra load without complaint, returning only strength and range. The American sergeant leading the scene seemed aware of his captive audience. He slapped the fuselage with his open palm and smiled without a word. The gesture said everything. This was no secret, no hidden wonder. It was routine. The casualness was the true insult. At the hangar's edge, another team of mechanics cataloged parts in wooden crates, each marked with numbers in black paint. Interchangeability gave the work a rhythm almost industrial. The same tank that fit a Mustang could, with slight adjustments, fit a Thunderbolt nearby. No one-off solutions, no handmade fixes. Just repeated pattern, like bricks in an endless wall. The Germans exchanged glances in silence, knowing this was no isolated trick. It was a mechanism that rewrote the game, shifting the calculations of routes, escorts, possible targets. One prisoner closed his eyes for a moment, perhaps remembering nights when he had flown until fuel ran dry, forced to turn back before finishing the mission. The memory clashed with the steady growl of the engine before him, fed by reserves that seemed without limit. And in that Texas heat, amid the smell of oil and the gleam of aluminum panels, the truth became clear. The secret wasn't just in steel or in engines, but in the simple logic that repeated without fail. A mechanism that would soon leave the hangar stage and prove itself over stormy seas, cloud-filled skies, and hostile territory, where it would show brutally just how much it could change the war. The morning still carried the freshness of the Kansas plains as the squadron of Mustangs lifted off in tight formation. The newborn sun glinted on polished metal, and the synchronized thrum of engines created a vibration that pressed through the pilots' chests. Each plane carried under its wings the silver tanks that had once seemed an impossible burden back in the hangar. But now, more than 2,000 meters up, they felt like a natural extension of the wings. Fuel flowed without interruption, the gauge needle holding steady, free of the old anxiety that haunted other wars. On the radio, the signal was clean. Each order transmitted without fail in FM waves that cut through static. While the Germans across the Atlantic still relied on short-range sorties, here the Mustang's wings stretched invisibly across the sky, as if an entire continent fit inside those auxiliary tanks. The training ended with soft landings, mechanics rushing to unfasten the fittings and swap out the emptied reservoirs in minutes. The smell of heated oil spread across the runway, but the pilots' faces stayed calm. They knew they hadn't just trained. They had pushed outward the very frontier of where the war could be fought. The cut brings us to a damp afternoon in England, months later. Fine rain beat against the hangar tarps at Debden, turning the ground into heavy mud. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and gasoline pooling in small, rainbow-colored puddles. Men pulled waterproof capes over their uniforms, but their hands never stopped. Drop tanks were being fastened under the wings of fighters already soaked by the storm. A lieutenant dashed between rows, his voice swallowed by the roar of engines warming up. Here there was none of Kansas's rehearsed order, only pressure, urgency, improvisation in hostile weather. And still, the same mechanism flowed. Hoses connected, fuel transferred, range extended so the squadron would not only cross the channel, but cut deep into France, into points once out of reach. When the fighters rose into the gray air, rain streaking down their metallic skins, the proof was plain. Even in mud, even under low clouds, the system held together, repeating its rhythm. From above, the pilots watched fog-draped fields slip away too fast for the Germans to react. Endurance became an invisible shield, a strength that remained where once only forced retreat existed. Night falls over occupied Germany, the sky cut by searchlight beams and the ragged fire of anti-aircraft guns. It is February 1944, and the four-engine bombers push heavily toward Leipzig, each loaded with explosives meant to shake the Reich's industrial heart. Not long ago, such a scene always ended the same way. Bombers left alone on the final stretch, escorts forced back by fuel limits. But that night, the long shadows of Mustangs still fly alongside them. The auxiliary tanks, now empty and discarded, had bought enough time to cross hundreds of kilometers of hostile air. The smell of cordite mixed with burnt oil, pilots breathing through oxygen masks, eyes locked on the formations they protected. Radios crackled with clipped commands, coordinates passed without static. When the first German fighters dove from above, expecting defenseless bombers, they met instead the wall of fire from American escorts. Tracer lines cut through darkness, the effect immediate. Formations held, targets struck in flames, engines roaring forward without turning back. In the hardest setting, enemy skies, maximum pressure, danger at every second, the mechanism proved its strength. Range, once an impossible paradox, had become an undeniable fact. From Kansas's quiet order, through England's mud, to the burning night over Leipzig, the same principle repeated like the steady beat of an industrial heart. It was no accident, no improvisation. It was a pattern multiplying with each takeoff, revealed more fully in every vignette. And in the darkness lit by anti-aircraft fire, the impression was unmistakable. This could be counted, measured, turned into numbers that spoke louder than any tale. The sound of the Merlin engine filled the hangar like a constant drum, but what held the prisoner's gaze was the fuel gauge. The needle moved slowly across a drop tank that gave more than 600 kilometers of effective range, twice what their own fighters could manage. The air reeked of raw gasoline, and the idea of crossing an entire continent on a single load felt like an insult. On the Inglewood assembly line, every 8-hour shift turned out nearly 150 aluminum drop tanks, ready for shipment. The impact wasn't in the cold number, but in the metallic rhythm. A sharp snap for every rivet set, hundreds of hammer strikes forming an industrial cadence. Welding smoke and the hiss of torches filled the air, while trucks hauled production straight into waiting freight cars. In flight, efficiency translated into time. It took less than 2 minutes here for a pilot to jettison an empty tank and regain the aircraft's full agility. The move was simple. Pull the lever, hear the crisp click, feel the weight vanish underfoot. The empty shell spun down into nothingness, and the fighter, unburdened, responded with the same lightness as a clean-winged machine. Onboard radios ran on the 30 MHz FM frequencies, stripping away the static that still plagued German sets. The effect was tangible. Clear voices piercing through engine roar, orders transmitted in seconds. In the cockpit's darkness, the pilot tuned the dial with gloved fingers and heard the reply with no interference. Across the front, the enemy still shouted through distortion and static. Behind the lines, production translated into volume. In 1944 alone, the U.S. built the tens of thousands of drop tanks, enough for every mission to have immediate replacements. The numbers stacked up in stamped reports. But in the ports, the signal came from the long whistle of locomotives departing with crates of wood. The smell of burnt oil and hot steel marked every shipment. In the skies, availability reached nearly 90% of fighters ready marine for daily missions. While the Germans had to choose which units could fly for lack of parts or fuel, here the routine ticked like a clock that never lost time. On England's airstrips, it sounded in the collective roar of engines firing up, all at once, without gaps. And when the bombers appeared in formation over Saxony's gray sky, they were shielded by squadrons that had already flown more than 5 continuous hours. Since takeoff, ice crusted on wing edges, artificial oxygen dried throats. But the fighters stayed. Tracer fire carved the night, sustained by invisible reserves that stretched flight far beyond expectations. The sum of these figures was no abstraction. They were kilometers of sky conquered, hours of endurance gained, tons produced without pause. Each number carried a sound, a smell, a real weight. And in that cadence of men and machines, a question hung over every hangar and every night sky. Who can stop a clock that never runs late? Night in Oberursel carried a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of a train crossing the tracks. Inside a makeshift interrogation hut, a stack of papers passed between American officers. They were reports, some written in the hurried scrawl of German pilots shot down weeks earlier, others dictated in halting English, translated line by line. The smell of burnt oil still clung to the uniforms collected with them, and the smudges of grease on the pages showed they had come straight from the cockpit. One testimony carried a phrase, short and blunt. "They stayed with us the whole time. We thought they'd turn back at the Rhine, but they didn't." The voice seemed to echo across the wooden walls, a whisper of disbelief captured in ink. Days later, in a prisoner camp in the English countryside, the same scene played out under a different light. The cold afternoon wind tugged at the flags above the gate, and in the mess hall, steam from soup rose in thin columns. At a metal table, a frail pilot scribbled in a worn notebook, tapping the pencil against the paper between broken sentences. When the guard stepped away, he raised his eyes and murmured to the comrade beside him, "It's not possible. They flew all the way to Leipzig and came back." His voice cracked, as if shock had not yet found its final words. The metallic clatter of trays hitting the counter sharpened the contrast. Abundance of food, abundance of range. None of it matched the scarcity they knew. Elsewhere in the chain, another account surfaced in the crackle of a field radio. An Allied operator, tasked with recording intercepted transmissions, had written down the urgent call of a German escort. The distorted voice, wrapped in static, said, "They're still here. They're still over us." It was a black night, and the yellow lamp in the shelter cast long shadows across the hastily scrawled page. The operator's quick breathing filled the gaps between words, and each stroke of graphite fixed a defeat already admitted in real time. In the same camp's corridors, guards reported hearing short, whispered exchanges after lights out. There was disbelief in those hushed tones, but also a kind of resignation. One prisoner, wrapped in a rough blanket, muttered in a fading voice, "They can be anywhere. There is no safe distance anymore." The jingle of keys on the guard's belt was the only reply. There, in the darkness broken by weak bulbs, no statistics were needed. The words alone carried the chill of night and the weight of breath. These voices, carved into stamped papers, caught in crackling radios, scribbled in notebooks, whispered into darkness, formed a singular mosaic. Each account carried not only the shock of aerial defeat, but the collapse of a certainty. The extended range, the silver tanks dropping over fields and seas, the unbroken presence that would not fade. It all seeped into those short lines, nervous gestures, eyes avoiding contact. And as the camera pulled back from faces etched with disbelief, it became clear these were not isolated echoes, but voices aligned, striking like hammers inside a larger mechanism yet to be revealed. Beyond the fences of the Texas camp, long after the metallic echo of silver tanks hitting hangar floors, the scene opens onto a desert of ore. In the bluish dawn, excavators bit into the earth with steel teeth. Trucks, like giant ants, crawled up and down slopes hauling the raw red that would feed the war. The air smelled of dust and diesel. In the distance, a whistle dragged out the day's first note, and as the foundry doors rose, furnace heat spilled everywhere. Molten metal ran like lava through dark channels, each pore spitting sparks that cracked against blackened boots. Presses slammed down with the weight of small mountains, turning ingots into gleaming sheets. Here began the anatomy of a wing, and also the smooth shell of the drop tanks that later would seem so ordinary under the midday sun. The light shifted from the orange glow of fire to the cold white of aluminum assembly lines. Conveyors dragged interchangeable parts across benches marked with black paint. Gloved hands passed rivets, pneumatic hammers sang in cadence, each strike leaving a silver dot pinning plates to structure. A supervisor signed a letterhead, red stamp thudding hard, and the document followed the part like a loyal shadow. Overhead, industrial lamps hummed. On the floor, grease marks mapped the repetition of labor. In the distance, a clock with long hands dictated the beat. Shift change, coffee break, shipping time. A silver tank took shape on a jig table. Nearby, technicians adjusted FM radios, their open panels revealing coils and valves glowing like tiny inner beacons. The air mixed scents: hot aluminum, light oil, carbon paper, strong coffee. Farther back, doors opened onto a yard lit by headlights in broad morning. Forklifts rumbled along wooden tracks. Crates stenciled in dark ink were checked by clipboards and graphite-smeared hands. Stamps thudded like drums. The rail depot breathed with locomotives venting steam, the ground shuddering as cars coupled. A crane bent its neck, lowering with giant delicacy a crate of tanks into the belly of a covered wagon. Seals snapped shut. The engineer clipped a notepad to the cab window with a strip of rubber. The train pulled away in steady tugs, rails humming like tuned strings. The convoy vanished behind warehouses and reappeared later, under drizzle. entering a deep-water port. Winches groaned wetly, cables screeched as loads rose, swaying against the gray sky. A Liberty ship, as tall as a building on the sea, breathed through open hatches. Pallets slid into its steel throat, the hold smelling of salt, wet rope, fresh paint. Workers wrapped in canvas coats shouted numbers into the wind. The ship's siren answered in a grave voice. Beside it, another hull took in boxes of radios, coils of wire, fuel filters. Rain streaked the deck. Boots left watery tracks across wood. The final horn ended the crane's dance, and the vessel drifted off, dragging a white wake that broke apart within seconds. Far away, the same cargo reappeared under a leaden sky on England's coast. Unloading happened under shielded spotlights, beams aimed low to avoid exposing ship outlines. Trucks idled with engines purring. The air smelled of heavy oil, wet wool, sweet tea, and tin mugs. Officers spread maps across soaked hoods, pinning corners with stones. The silver tanks, now stacked on a depot floor, bore the same stamp as the paper from the factory, marks traveling with them, silent witnesses of every border crossed. The gravel road turned to mud, wheels churned the earth, crates swayed like pendulums. Further on, light shifted again. Stark industrial lamps lit a hangar at the edge of an airbase. Workshops pulsed with the urgency of men tied to takeoff clocks. A mechanic scratched minutes on the edge of a clipboard, another greased a joint. A tank hissed under air compression testing. A valve sighed. An approval tag slipped into a brown envelope and reappeared pasted to a smaller box of seals and rings. A radio played faint music, cut by crisp bulletins, no static. The smell here was oily, metallic, edged with a solvent sharp as camphor. On the quartermaster's desk, a black phone rattled, answered by a hand still holding a pencil. 3 squadrons, dawn, closed weather. He repeated the list, wrote it down clean, tore the page with a snap. The system breathed. Next door, rest was brief and methodical. Pilots passed a board marked with colored pins. Names slid from one column to another as coldly as crate-switched cars. An open diary on a cot recorded in plain English. Tanks ready. Unstable weather. Keep FM radio clear. The window shook with wind, and outside someone lit a cigarette under a helmet brim, shielding the glow with his hand. Smoke rose, mingling with the kerosene smell that seemed to seep from the runways all night long. Farther still, almost out of earshot, a high-windowed room glowed yellow. Maps spread across a great table. Pins and twine sketched routes over seas and fields. Wall clocks pointed to different hours. Telephones rang in sequence. An officer traced a finger over a grid of times and, without raising his voice, authorized the convoy of trucks headed to the chain's last link. No one here thought of the silver tank as a miracle. It was one organ in a body that moved without drama. The dock feeding the rail feeding the hangar feeding the wing. In the diary of a German prisoner somewhere in England, a single line tried to capture the shock of the invisible. Everything arrives. It always arrives. The handwriting was firm, almost bitter. Beside it, a blot of ink that hadn't dried in time. And then the night gave back the runway. Headlights cut across the concrete, the air snapped with cold, men pushed tool carts. The silver tanks gleamed like fish out of water for a second before vanishing into the bellies of fighters. The roar rose in waves, first one engine, then 2, then an entire row, turning into steady wind. In the background, the depot sealed its doors. At the port, another siren marked one ship departing as another docked. In the map room, lines stretched further, a new time penciled in. And when the first plane raised its nose and disappeared eastward, the whole system seemed to move with it, from the press that set the rivet to the clock hand ticking forward on the wall. Night became day across the complex, and the map on the wall, strung with threads, no longer showed a route. It showed a network, lit end to end, ready for the climax to come. Thick pre-dawn in England, wind slicing through hangar tarps, damp clinging to coveralls. In the distance, the base wakes like a power plant. Metal doors lift, white lights snap on in sequence. Tool carts glide along painted lanes on the floor. In the yard, silver fuel tanks wait on trestles, perfect rows, beads of dew shining like glass. A sergeant slaps the palm of his hand against the first Mustang's fuselage and points to the clock. It's the exact hour. Mechanics fit, lock, run a fingertip along the seal to feel its seat. The dry click of latches repeats from wing to wing, a cadence that makes any speech unnecessary. No one mentions the old paradox. It sits here, resolved in gestures. From the ops shelter comes a sheaf of orders with fresh stamps. Hands collect it without hurry. In the background, crates marked from a recent port, holds emptied of Liberty ships, lie open, as if the trip from sea to runway were the natural motion of the same muscle. The first Mustang turns over, then another, then a whole row. The sound lines up, low and steady until it becomes wind. Pilots settle into their seats, oxygen masks within reach, hands running the panel in a quiet ritual. In their headsets, FM sets deliver clean voices, no static, only brief confirmations, the same words repeated with different inflections. Wings low, calm taxi, navigation lights blinking on every tip like a shared code. Across the field, the shadows of four-engine bombers roll forward with slow weight. The scene speeds up without frenzy, runway cleared, wheels up, tanks shining under the wings like bound promises. Fuel needles climb, unbothered. No one needs to look at the horizon to know it has moved farther away. Over the channel, the gray of dawn opens into a cold brightness. The formation stretches, multiple altitudes, multiple speeds, and the web of voices stays clear. Wind shakes the wingtips. Mist beads burst into fine grains that scratch across the plexiglass and vanish behind. Below, scraps of land slip away too quickly for the old doctrine. The escort leader speaks once, 2 words, 1 heading. The reply comes in a restrained chorus, no euphoria, conviction living in tone. The outer line checks pressure, switches feed, confirms the auxiliary tanks are flowing steady. The heavy bombers in the center breathe together, but they no longer look exposed. There's a ring of presence that doesn't dissolve with distance. Once, hands would have been anxious. Now, fuel that used to be missing has turned into time. Time turns into decision. They enter enemy sky while the sun is still a pale blade. Flak wakes in muffled bursts. Tracers rise like strands of copper light. The first German group dives, confident in the old math that said the escort would peel away. But the silver silhouettes do not give ground. A brief sequence. A hand pulls the lever, a metallic snap, 2 belly tanks drop and spin in the void like tins of light. Relief runs through the frame, and the answer is physical. The aircraft bites the wind, climbs a little, comes head on. The voices in the headset stay clean. Vectors, altitudes, a short warning, no shouting. The bombers hold their track like a train on straight rails. Above, below, and off the flanks, the Mustangs fall into the pattern with the ease of routine. Those who once laughed at the weight that would drain a fighter's soul now watch the opposite. Weight shed when it should be. Range turned into maneuver, maneuver into protection. The result falls across the field like forecast rain. The first passes break the enemy's momentum. A sure dive opens space. Fire that once fixed on bombers scatters to survive. There's no show. There's constancy. A few heavy seconds between one contact and the next, and the system speaks again. Left, high. Correcting, continue, a web of instructions woven without noise. In the bomb bays, gloved hands touch levers, blades of light cut through round windows. Metal vibrates like drum skin. Along the column, small German hesitations appear and dissolve. The math has changed, and everyone knows it. On the way back, the mountain ranges of cloud open a white corridor. The formation stays tight, and the rumor of engines trails the earth like a shadow. The base receives them with runway lights still blazing into full morning. Tires kiss the concrete with a breath of dust. Empty tanks will be gathered up. Others will roll in from crates still damp with sea salt. Mechanics run without rushing, repeating movements that have become muscle memory. Pilots rise slowly, lift off their headsets like closing a book they know by heart. No one explains. No one needs to. The paradox from the opening, extra weight that should have tied the wings down, stands resolved on the ground, in looks exchanged, in the cadence of hands that already know what to do. After laughter, attentive silence. After fear, coordination. After doubt, respect. In the ops shelter, the map takes 2 new pins and a pencil line pushes the route past what once seemed possible. Outside, the runway lights stay on despite daylight, as if refusing to go dark. The collective perception has shifted. The path now looks obvious. What remains is to say, with the simplicity the scene demands, what it all adds up to. What once seemed an impossible weight under the wings proved, in fact, to be the breath that stretched the sky. Those silver tanks, once a source of laughter and disbelief, turned out to be part of a larger mechanism, as natural as the steady sound of engines and the line traced on the map. It wasn't a trick, nor a fluke. It was the logic of range turned into routine, and faced with it, there was only the evidence to accept. The horizon no longer had a place to end. The hollow knock of knuckles on aluminum comes back first. Decades later, it's no longer a Texas hangar, but a museum hall in Dayton, late afternoon filtered through tall windows. A guide runs his hand over the smooth curve of a drop tank, hung like a silver fish, and the touch produces the same short chime that once rang over tools and hurried voices. Children crane their necks. A veteran presses an ear close, not out of loud nostalgia, but to hear what he has always heard, that the apparent emptiness carried distance. On the metal placard, plain letters, Drop Tank, P-51. Below it, a yellowed manual, Mount and Release Procedure, 1944. Open to the page that sketches, without poetry, the lever and the pin. The paper smells like stored paper. The ink has a faint, oily sheen. The day's last light creeps a few inches and stops on a single rivet, as if choosing exactly what to illuminate. Far from there, the world that sustained it has thinned and changed. Aluminum lines were dismantled and later reappeared under other names, making utensils, stoves, small motors that warm kitchens. The factory whistle that once pulled men into the night shift now marks the noon break. The same presses descend slower, the tone lower, and still leave in the air the smell of oil and hot iron. In empty warehouses, old crates serve as picnic tables. Someone sands aside and reveals, beneath coats of paint, black letters that still spell out destination and lot number. At the port, cranes rust with dignity. Beyond the fence, a technical school occupies sheds where a Liberty ship swallowed pallets. Students run hands over idle machines, and a teacher points out without fuss how the logic of interchangeable parts migrated into everyday upkeep. Buses, tractors, water pumps fixed by swapping modules, not by improvising miracles. There are classrooms where the subject seems modest and yet carries the same idea. An instructor draws a serial feed on the board and explains why simplicity beats clever improvisation. On the shelf, a thick cloth-bound log gathers procedures from decades. Checklist, pre-flight, onboard FM radios, signal test. The cover smells of dry grease, the spine of a closed room that never lost its solvent tang. In newer pages, the handwriting changes and the words are different, but the motion is the same. Lower friction, repeat patterns, drop weight when it weighs, keep flow when it's scarce. The doctrine once made flesh in factories survived less as monument and more as habit, perhaps the most durable form of memory. Some men kept that legacy in their bodies. The mechanic who once ran through rain with a tank in his arms now walks slowly across his yard. The skin of his hand still holds the grooves of a wrench. His ear picks out, on the street, when an engine works full and when it's calling for help. He keeps a wooden toolbox at home, notches the palm can read with eyes closed. Sometimes he opens a brown envelope and pulls out a photograph. The yard with headlights blazing into morning, the shadows of 4 engine bombers, someone smiling without showing teeth. The frame has flaked at the corners. The silver in the image has begun to drift. Even so, when he looks at it, he hears the unison of engines and, above all, the cadence of latch clicks that once solved a paradox. The silence after the laughter. Others inherited the idea without knowing its name. A young pilot, in another time and setting, repeats a panel ritual. His hand passes over switches as if reading Braille. The voice in his radio arrives clean, without static. Decision moves into the space that anxiety left behind. The method, refined, travels invisibly inside routines. On a training field, a schedule board organizes flights and maintenance with spreadsheet coolness. Someone pins up a new card with a red tack. The shift of one line silently rearranges the machinery around it. There is no visible heroism, but there is a respect learned without orders. Respect for the flow that sustains reach. In the museum, night gathers and drains the colors until only silver, black, and a little amber from the lamps remain. The guide puts the manual away in a string-tied envelope. The veteran touches a rivet before stepping back, a short gesture like a blessing that needs no words. Outside, wind combs the parking lot and shakes a tired flag. On the horizon, city lights trace another network, more domestic, made of the same weave. Memory here doesn't live in metal. It lives in the habits metal taught. The ring of hollow aluminum, heard again so many years later, doesn't speak of an object. It speaks of an idea that found its form. And maybe that is what remains when dust settles, when paint peels, when clocks are no longer the same. The plain certainty that reach is not brute force, It is organization turned into habit. The rest is horizon. And horizon, learned this way, takes a long time to end.